In heavy metal and rock, reputations take years to build. The albums, the tours, the nights in the pit, when the music hit exactly right and you knew you were witnessing something that mattered. Building that connection with an audience requires sustained work, consistent output, and 1,000 small decisions that add up to trust. Destroying it can take less than a minute. One night, one statement, one decision, 20 names, 20 careers that went sideways so fast that the music press could barely keep up with the speed of the collapse. Here is what actually happened. 1. Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses. At the peak of the Use Your Illusion era in 1991, Guns N' Roses were arguably the biggest rock band on the planet. The double album had come out in September. The world tour was selling out every venue in its path. Axl Rose had a voice unlike anything the genre had produced and a stage presence that made every show feel genuinely unpredictable. That unpredictability was part of the appeal. It was also the thing that was going to cost him everything. On July 2, 1991, Guns N' Roses were headlining the Riverport Amphitheater in Maryland Heights, Missouri. Near St. Louis, 17 songs into the set, Rose spotted a fan in the crowd with a camera. He jumped off the stage, attempted to grab the device, climbed back up, dropped the microphone, and walked off stage. The show was over. What followed was a full riot inside the venue. Seats were ripped out. Equipment was destroyed. 12 people required hospital treatment. Property damage exceeded $200,000. St. Louis authorities issued a warrant for Rose's arrest on charges of assault and property damage. He did not return to Missouri for years. The Riverport incident made every front page connected to rock music. Kerrang! And Metal Hammer ran it as cover material. Promoters across the world began inserting Rose clauses into contracts. The band that had been on top of the world 4 months earlier was now the band you might not be able to book. The trust that arena headlining requires was gone. And if you think one riot was enough to define a career, the next entry on this list managed to destroy decades of goodwill with a single sentence on a stage in Hollywood. 2. Phil Anselmo, Pantera. Phil Anselmo was one of the most respected frontmen in heavy metal. Pantera's run from Cowboys from Hell through the Great Southern Trendkill built a connection with the metal community that went beyond commercial success into something the genre rarely produces genuine trust. The people who packed venues to hear Walk or Mouth for War felt that the band was speaking to something real in their experience. That trust was decades in the making. On January 22, 2016, at the Dime Bash tribute concert at the Lucky Strike Live venue in Hollywood, California, a concert held specifically to honor the memory of Dimebag Darrell Abbott Anselmo, finished his set. Raised his arm in what appeared to be a Nazi salute, and shouted white power at the crowd. His initial public statement described it as a reference to white wine and a drunken joke. The response was immediate. Promoters across Europe and the United States dropped him from festival bookings within days. Down, the band he fronted lost shows. Metal Hammer and Revolver covered the fallout extensively. Vinnie Paul Abbott, who had never forgiven Anselmo for what he believed his behavior had contributed to Pantera's end, issued a statement that left no ambiguity about where he stood. The specific location of the betrayal is what makes this the most personal career implosion on this list. This was not a random show. It was a tribute concert for a murdered former bandmate in front of the community that had mourned that murder. The music Anselmo made with Pantera remains some of the most important in the genre's history. The night of January 22, 2016, sits permanently in front of it, and if Anselmo's collapse came from a single gesture, the next entry on this list made his most career-defining decision behind the wheel of a car. 3. Vince Neil, Motley Crue. Vince Neil was the frontman of Motley Crue at the moment the band was ascending toward the commercial dominance that would make them one of the defining acts of the glam metal era. The Sunset Strip scene they helped build was generating its first real mainstream attention. Neil was at the front of it, the voice on the records that every kid in a denim jacket was playing at maximum volume across the country. On December 8, 1984, Neil and Hanoi Rocks drummer Razzle Dingley left a party in Redondo Beach, California to make a beer run. Neil was driving. He was intoxicated. The car crossed into oncoming traffic and hit another vehicle. Razzle died from his injuries. 2 people in the other car were seriously hurt. Neil was charged with vehicular manslaughter. He pleaded no contest and served 19 days of a 30-day sentence at the Torrance City Jail. He paid $2.5 million in civil settlements. He was back on stage within weeks. The sentence generated sustained outrage in the metal press and among fans who followed the case closely. 19 days as the consequence for a death caused by drunk driving became the standard reference point whenever the subject of celebrity justice came up in interviews for years afterward. Razzle had been 24 years old. Hanoi Rocks, one of the most influential pre-glam bands operating at the time, dissolved in the aftermath of his death. Their commercial breakthrough extinguished on a December night in California. Neil's career continued. The knowledge of what it had cost never went away. And if Neil's moment came from a single terrible decision, the next entry on this list built an entire career around decisions that eventually burned the stage down around him. 4. Fred Durst. Limp Bizkit. Fred Durst was the face of nu metal at the peak of its commercial dominance. Limp Bizkit were headlining festivals and moving units at a rate that made them one of the most commercially significant rock acts of the late 90s. Significant results may vary, and Chocolate Starfish and the hot dog-flavored water had both been massive. Durst was everywhere. MTV Headbangers Ball, Twirl magazine covers. The band had the world. On July 25, 1999, Limp Bizkit performed at Woodstock 99 in Rome, New York. The festival had been badly organized from the start: inadequate water, food prices that gouged a captive audience, insufficient sanitation, and a security framework that was overwhelmed before the weekend was half over. By the time Limp Bizkit took the stage for an evening set that the crowd had been baking in the sun building toward, the environment was a pressure cooker. Durst encouraged the crowd repeatedly during the set. The pit became increasingly violent. Several women in the audience were assaulted during the performance. The festival deteriorated into fires and destruction before the night was out. 3 women died. Durst later said he did not know anyone was being hurt. The footage of his stage performance, cross-referenced with the timeline of what was happening in the crowd, told a more complicated story. Kerrang! And Rolling Stone documented the fallout extensively. The nu metal backlash that had been building in the critical press accelerated dramatically after Woodstock 99. For a significant portion of the rock audience, Fred Durst became the face of everything wrong with what the genre had produced commercially. The band kept going, but the cultural position they had occupied evaporated. And if Durst's collapse came from a festival that went wrong, the next entry on this list collapsed in front of a camera in a hotel room. 5. Scott Stapp. Creed. Scott Stapp fronted Creed through one of the most commercially dominant runs in 90s rock. The band sold tens of millions of albums. Human Clay moved over 11 million copies in the United States alone. Whatever the critical establishment thought about the music, the commercial facts were undeniable. Stapp had built a career at a scale that most musicians never approach, and the fan base that built it with him had done so with genuine investment. In November 2012, Stapp posted a video from what appeared to be a hotel room. He stated that he had $2 in his bank account. He described his financial situation in terms that were disorienting to anyone who had followed Creed's commercial trajectory. He appeared visibly distressed throughout. The video ran for several minutes and addressed his financial collapse, his estrangement from his family, and his general state in language that raised immediate concern among everyone who saw it. The video spread across the internet within hours. The music press picked it up immediately. The gap between the commercial scale of what Creed had achieved and the personal reality the video revealed was so wide that initial responses included questions about whether it was authentic. It was authentic. His story across the following years involved substance abuse treatment, legal and personal difficulties, and a sustained attempt to rebuild a life and career from a position that the video had exposed to the world in real time. What he had commercially had been enormous. The night that video posted, the distance between what the career had generated and what remained became public information. And if Stapp's collapse was financial, the next entry on this list destroyed her career with a sheet of paper and 11 seconds of television. 6. Sinead O'Connor, solo Sinead O'Connor, had one of the most distinctive and emotionally powerful voices in rock music and the commercial success to prove it. Nothing Compares to You in 1990 had been one of the defining singles of the era, and the video that accompanied it, featuring just her face and that voice, had demonstrated what popular music could do when it stripped everything back to pure feeling. She was 25 years old and at the peak of her commercial momentum. On October 3rd, 1992, she appeared on Saturday Night Live and performed an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, substituting the word racism in the original with the word child abuse. At the end of the performance, she held up a photograph of Pope John Paul II and tore it in half. She said the words "Fight the real enemy" and dropped the pieces on the floor. The NBC switchboard received over 4,000 calls in the hour after the broadcast. The response from the American public was overwhelmingly hostile. Joe Pesci hosted the following week and appeared on stage carrying taped-together pieces of a Pope photograph, saying that if he were hosting the previous week, he would have given her a smack. Frank Sinatra told interviewers he wanted to kick her ass. Her albums were pulled from some radio station playlists. A protest outside 30 Rockefeller Plaza involved a steamroller driving over copies of her records. Her subsequent commercial trajectory never recovered the position the Snell performance had cost her. The music she made after 1992 was sometimes extraordinary. The audience that might have bought it at the scale Nothing Compares had reached was no longer accessible to her in the same way. And if O'Connor's destruction came from conviction, the next entry on this list lost his career in a dispute about who owned the biggest riff in thrash metal. If this kind of deep dive into what the genre doesn't always talk about is what you're here for, subscribe. There are more of these coming, and they matter. 7. Dave Lee Roth Van Halen / solo Dave Lee Roth was the most charismatic and verbally gifted frontman in hard rock during Van Halen's commercial peak, and the band's run from the debut album in 1978 through 1984 represented one of the most commercially successful and creatively consistent periods in the genre's history. His departure from Van Halen in 1985 was framed publicly as a mutual creative decision. The reality was messier. The solo career that followed was supposed to be the beginning of something even bigger. Eat, and Smile in 1986 with guitarist Steve Vai generated genuine commercial momentum and critical respect. Then, the trajectory inverted. Skyscraper in 1988 performed adequately. A Little Ain't Enough in 1991 underperformed. Each successive release moved further from the commercial position his Van Halen years had established. The interviews became louder as the album sales became quieter. By the mid-90s, Roth was doing comedy bits and radio hosting rather than headlining arenas. The moment that crystallized the collapse for the metal press was a 1996 reunion with Van Halen that collapsed publicly before it produced any music, with both parties providing contradictory accounts of what had happened and why. The optics of a failed reunion on top of a failed solo career created a narrative the industry summarized quickly. The best version of Dave Lee Roth was the version that stood in front of Eddie Van Halen's guitar. His story illustrates a trap that the genre has sprung on some of its most visible frontmen, the discovery that the charisma which made you indispensable in a great band can be insufficient to sustain a solo career when the band's actual musical engine is no longer providing the foundation. And if Roth fell because of what he lost, the next entry on this list fell because of what he wore. 8. Sebastian Bach Skid Row. Sebastian Bach had one of the most naturally gifted voices in the history of glam metal, and Skid Row's commercial peak, built on the 1989 self-titled debut and Slave to the Grind in 1991, demonstrated that his talent could compete with the biggest acts the era was producing. He was physically striking, vocally exceptional, and capable of commanding arenas. The career in front of him looked limitless. At a 1989 Skid Row show in Springfield, Massachusetts, a fan threw a bottle that hit Bach in the face. He threw it back into the crowd. He then grabbed a T-shirt that had been thrown on stage. He put it on. The shirt read "AIDS kills fags dead." He wore it for the remainder of the set. The incident was documented and reported. Protests followed. MTV addressed it publicly. The gay rock and metal community, which had been building visibility across the late 80s, responded directly and forcefully. Other artists in the scene distanced themselves. Skid Row management had to respond. Bach's position within the band was never the same after the way the incident was handled and the impression it left. He later apologized, and the sincerity of that apology has been acknowledged by people who know him. But the damage to his public image in a specific and important direction was immediate and sustained. When Skid Row eventually parted ways with him in 1996, the shirt incident was part of a pattern of behavior that had made his position untenable inside a band that was already navigating a difficult commercial landscape. And if Bach's destruction came from a moment of thoughtlessness, the next entry on this list was convicted of a crime he committed deliberately. 9. Tommy Lee Motley Crue. Tommy Lee was the drummer and a founding member of Motley Crue through the band's entire commercial arc, from the raw energy of Too Fast for Love through the polished dominance of Dr. Feelgood. His personal life in the 90s was as documented as his professional one, the marriages, the tabloid coverage. The high-profile relationship with Pamela Anderson that put him on magazine covers that had nothing to do with metal. He was one of the most recognizable figures in rock celebrity culture throughout the decade. In February 1998, Tommy Lee was arrested following an incident at the couple's home in Malibu, California. Anderson was nursing their infant son at the time of the assault. Lee was charged with felony spousal battery. He pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 6 months in the Los Angeles County Jail in Castaic, California. He served approximately 4 months. The conviction received coverage across every entertainment publication in the country. Rolling Stone, Metal Hammer, the Los Angeles Times, all of them documented the case in detail. Anderson spoke publicly about the assault. The children they shared were part of custody proceedings that extended the public dimensions of the case for years. Motley Crue continued. Lee continued. The Dirt documentary and the eventual farewell tour both included him. But the 1998 conviction established a permanent biographical fact that his commercial rehabilitation has never erased, and that every journalist writing about the band has had to address in every profile since. And if Lee's collapse was personal and documented, The next entry on this list collapsed in a way that the entire genre watched in real time. 10. Steven Adler. Guns N' Roses. Steven Adler was the original drummer of Guns N' Roses and was present for the recording of Appetite for Destruction, one of the best-selling debut albums in the history of rock music. His playing powered the tracks that would make the band globally famous, and his position as a founding member of that specific lineup connected him permanently to one of the most valuable recordings in the genre's commercial history. Adler's heroin addiction progressed throughout the band's commercial ascent to the point where his ability to perform and record reliably became a serious concern for the people around him. During the sessions for the tracks that would become the Use Your Illusion albums, his playing was documented as significantly compromised. The band hired session drummers to complete parts he was unable to deliver consistently. In July 1990, Guns N' Roses dismissed him from the band. He filed a lawsuit alleging that the band had gotten him addicted to heroin in the first place and had wrongly terminated him. The case was settled out of court for approximately $2.5 million. He missed the Use Your Illusion tours, the most commercially successful touring cycle of the band's entire career, along with the associated income, and was not part of the band that became a stadium-filling global institution in 1991 and 1992. The gap between the commercial trajectory he had been on as a founding member of that band and the financial and professional reality he navigated across the following decades is one of the more striking illustrations of what addiction can cost at exactly the wrong moment. And if Adler's fall came from addiction, the next entry on this list walked away from one of the biggest bands in metal voluntarily, for reasons that nobody saw coming. 11. Brian Head Welch. Korn. Brian Head Welch was a founding guitarist of Korn and a central creative force during the years the band helped establish nu metal as one of the most commercially dominant sounds in heavy music. Korn were selling millions of records, headlining Download Festival and Ozfest, and building a fan base with a loyalty that few acts in the genre had matched. From the outside, the career looked completely solid. Head was at the top of the game. In February 2005, Welch announced he was leaving Korn. The reason was a religious conversion. He had become a Christian and determined that continuing with the band was incompatible with his new beliefs. The announcement came when Korn were still commercially active and relevant, which made it one of the more disorienting exits the nu metal scene had produced. The immediate commercial consequence for him personally was significant. Walking away from one of the genre's most commercially successful bands at the moment it was still generating arena-level income meant surrendering a financial position that most musicians never reach. His solo material and the public work he did around his conversion reached an audience, but a different one from the fan base that Korn had built. He returned to Korn in 2013, a reunion that was received warmly by the fan base and that demonstrated the commercial platform he had left was still there. But the 8 years between the departure and the return represented a period of professional self-removal from the genre's conversation that was entirely his own decision. And if Welch left by choice, the next entry on this list was removed by the people he had built everything with. 12. Geoff Tate. Queensryche. Geoff Tate was the voice that defined Queensryche during their most celebrated period and the vocalist whose performances on Operation Mindcrime and Empire placed the band at the absolute peak of what progressive metal could achieve commercially and artistically. His 4-octave range and his ability to inhabit the conceptual narratives of the band's most ambitious records made him the specific instrument through which those albums became significant. He was the reason people bought those records. In April 2012, the remaining members of Queensryche voted to remove Tate from the band while on tour in Brazil. The circumstances surrounding the dismissal included allegations of physical assault against band members and crew that Tate disputed. What followed was one of the most public and legally complex band divorces in the history of progressive metal. Both parties attempted to tour simultaneously under variations of the Queensryche name, producing the genuinely confusing situation of two different groups performing the same catalog in different venues for a fan base trying to determine which version deserved their ticket purchase. The legal resolution in 2014 awarded the band name to the majority, and Tate was given specific rights to perform the Mindcrime and Empire albums. The legal bills, the public dispute, and the years of competing tours cost both sides commercially in ways that the music's enduring quality did not deserve to produce. Tate's reputation as the voice on those records remains intact. His reputation as a professional colleague was the casualty, and if Tate's career was undone by internal conflict. The next entry on this list had his career ended by law enforcement at a gym in California. 13. Tim Lambesis. As I Lay Dying. Tim Lambesis built As I Lay Dying into one of the most commercially successful and critically respected bands in the Christian metalcore scene. They were Grammy-nominated. The connection between the music's explicit moral framework and the fan base that had built their career around it was specific and deeply held. Lambesis was the frontman, the voice, and the face of everything the band claimed to stand for. On May 7, 2013, he was arrested in Oceanside, California, on charges of solicitation of murder. He had attempted to hire a hitman to kill his estranged wife, Megan. The hitman was an undercover sheriff's deputy. Lambesis had provided the deputy with an envelope containing $1,000 in cash, his wife's home address, the security gate code, photographs of her, and 3 specific dates on which he would have custody of their adopted children and therefore an alibi. He had agreed to pay $20,000 for the killing. He pleaded guilty in February 2014 and was sentenced to 6 years in prison by Judge Carlos Armour in San Diego Superior Court. Rolling Stone covered the sentencing. Metal Hammer ran the story in full. The Christian metal community's response was some of the most visceral collective shock the genre had produced in years. He was released in 2016 and eventually reformed As I Lay Dying. The reunion generated its own controversy about whether the reformation was appropriate. The fan base that had believed in the music had to find their own position on that question. Many have found they cannot. And if Lambesis destroyed his career with a decision made at a gym in Carlsbad, the next entry on this list destroyed his with a decision made on a stage in Glasgow. 14. Glenn Danzig Misfits / Danzig. Glenn Danzig built 2 of the most influential catalogs in the history of heavy punk and metal. The Misfits recordings from the late 70s and early 80s remain canonical documents in the genre. The Danzig catalog that followed brought a blues-infused heaviness that Metallica, Slayer, and an entire generation of metal bands acknowledged as a direct reference point. His creative contribution to the sound and aesthetic of heavy music was substantial and real. On August 28, 2004, Danzig was performing at a festival in Tuba City, Arizona. A backstage altercation occurred between him and Northside Kings vocalist Danny Marianino. What followed was captured on video. Marianino connected with a single punch. Danzig went down. The footage was brief, clear, and immediately available online. The video circulated across every metal forum and music platform that existed in 2004. Kerrang! And Metal Hammer both addressed it. The specific image of Danzig, who had spent years cultivating an image of genuine intimidation and physical danger, being knocked out by a single punch in what was essentially a parking lot altercation, was the most damaging possible visual for exactly the persona he had built. Marianino's account of what preceded the physical confrontation described behavior from Danzig that provided context for what the footage showed. The merchandise dispute and the alleged threats that preceded the punch were documented in interviews. But what most people who saw the story remembered was the footage. The mythology of Danzig as a physically imposing and genuinely dangerous presence was a central part of his brand. That specific part of the brand did not survive 2004. And if Danzig's image took the hit, the next entry on this list lost something more concrete. 15. Dave Mustaine, Megadeth Dave Mustaine, is one of the most important figures in the history of thrash metal. And the career he built with Megadeth after being fired from Metallica in 1983 represents one of the more remarkable responses to professional rejection in the genre's history. Rust in Peace and Countdown to Extinction are records that stand without qualification among the most significant in thrash. His guitar playing and songwriting demonstrated a talent that every serious discussion of the genre has to account for. The firing from Metallica, carried out in a New Jersey parking lot with a bus ticket back to Los Angeles as the mechanism of delivery, lit a competitive fire that Mustaine carried into nearly every major interview he gave for the following 4 decades. The professional wound that produced Megadeth also became the story Mustaine told most consistently and most publicly. Every Metal Hammer profile, every Revolver feature, every podcast appearance returned to the same territory. His public statements across the 2000s and 2010s extended the pattern into political and religious territory that alienated portions of a fan base that had been willing to accept the Metallica grievance as understandable, if not always sympathetic. The comment in 2012 suggesting that a sitting president had staged mass shootings generated significant mainstream backlash that went considerably beyond anything previous Mustaine controversies had produced. His career survived all of it because the music was too strong to be entirely overwhelmed. But the reputation Mustaine built as someone whose legitimate grievances were accompanied by a consistent pattern of public self-damage is part of the record now. The talent and the chip on his shoulder arrived together. The next entry on this list had no chip. He had a mugshot. 16. Carl Logan Manowar. Carl Logan was Manowar's lead guitarist for over 2 decades and one of the primary musical architects of the band's identity during some of their most commercially active years. He performed at Wacken Open Air multiple times in front of the festival's enormous audiences, representing what Manowar had always positioned as metal's most committed and most mythologically serious culture. The band's entire identity rested on a concept of metal brotherhood and warrior honor that their marketing sustained across every album cycle. In September 2018, Logan was arrested in Iredell County, North Carolina. The investigation had uncovered multiple videos on his electronic devices depicting the sexual abuse of young children. Some of the victims in the material appeared to be infants. Manowar severed all professional ties with him within a week of the arrest. The band's public statement was direct and immediate. In 2022, Logan pleaded guilty to multiple counts of second-degree sexual exploitation of a minor. He was sentenced to just over a decade in prison. The specific irony of what he had been doing relative to the culture the band spent decades promoting was not lost on anyone who followed the case. Manowar's catalog, built on the language of brotherhood, loyalty, and honor, stood directly adjacent to what Carl Logan was convicted of. The performances he delivered at Wacken and on world tours now exist in a context that was invisible to everyone in those audiences and that changes the context of every one of them retroactively. And if Logan's collapse was about what he hid, the next entry on this list destroyed himself entirely in public. 17. Scott Weiland. Stone Temple Pilot Scott Weiland had one of the most recognizable voices in the heavier side of 90s rock, and Stone Temple Pilots built a catalog during the grunge era that demonstrated consistent commercial and critical viability across multiple albums. Core in 1992 launched the band. Purple in 1994 confirmed they were not a one-cycle act. His vocal performances on those records placed him alongside the most important voices the era produced. The career he had built by the mid-90s was genuine and substantial. The addiction issues that ran through his career became impossible to manage within the professional demands STP required. He was fired from Stone Temple Pilots in 2013 via a public statement released online. A method of termination that underscored how completely the relationship between him and his bandmates had deteriorated. He had been fired from Velvet Revolver in 2008 under similar circumstances. The pattern across both departures told a consistent story about what working alongside his addiction had cost the people around him. His later career involved solo projects that demonstrated his voice remained intact, but that operated at a commercial altitude far below his 90s peak. He was found dead on his tour bus on December 3, 2015. Before a scheduled performance in Bloomington, Minnesota, toxicology confirmed a combination of alcohol, cocaine, and MDA. What Weiland had at his peak was real, and the recordings demonstrate it. The addiction that ran alongside the talent consumed everything the career should have built and cost him the professional relationships that might have sustained the later chapters. And if Weiland's destruction was slow and sustained, the next entry on this list went from the top of the world to a prison cell inside a calendar year. 18. Varg Vikernes. Burzum Varg Vikernes created atmospheric black metal recordings under the Burzum name that shaped the direction of the genre in ways that musicians and critics still reference. The early albums had genuine artistic power, and the influence they exerted on subsequent generations of extreme metal musicians was real and direct. He was one of the most discussed figures in the Norwegian black metal scene, and his Burzum project had generated serious attention within the genre's most committed circles. On the night of August 10, 1993, Vikernes drove to the apartment of Øystein Aarseth, the Mayhem guitarist known as Euronymous, with whom he had been in escalating conflict over music royalties and personal disputes. Euronymous was stabbed 23 times and died in the stairwell of his building. Vikernes was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 21 years, the maximum available under Norwegian law. He was also convicted of multiple church arsons that had destroyed historic Norwegian structures, some dating to the 12th century. He served 15 years before being released. The career that followed his release produced music and writing that generated attention primarily because of what he had done before the incarceration. His recordings from 1992 and 1993 remain the most discussed and most influential work he produced. What came after them carries the permanent context of a man who murdered his collaborator and destroyed irreplaceable cultural heritage as ideological statements. The artistic credibility that the early recordings established and the criminal record that exists alongside them are both permanent features of the same biography. And if Vikernes destroyed his career through violence, the next entry on this list did it through something that looked, to everyone watching, like a choice. 19. Courtney Love Hole. Courtney Love fronted Hole through their most commercially and critically significant period, and lived through this from 1994, is a record that stands as a genuine artistic achievement regardless of the biographical noise that has always surrounded it. Her vocal performances and songwriting demonstrated a talent that the conversation around her has rarely managed to assess cleanly because the surrounding circumstances have never allowed a clean assessment to develop. Her husband, Kurt Cobain, died on April 5, 1994. Live Through This came out 4 days later. The period that followed was one of the most heavily documented personal collapses in rock history, played out across MTV, tabloid covers, and court proceedings simultaneously. The industry watched in something between concern and fascination. A 1999 MTV Video Music Awards appearance where she confronted Madonna backstage and disrupted an interview in ways that were broadcast and discussed widely, crystallized a public image that was making it increasingly difficult to separate her from the chaos that surrounded her. The legal disputes, the accusations against former bandmates, the social media behavior that accelerated through the 2000s and 2010s, all of it accumulated into a record that the best work she produced has never managed to get in front of cleanly. She is capable of extraordinary music. Live Through This remains evidence of what she is capable of at her best. The industry's difficulty engaging with that capability without the surrounding context arriving simultaneously has been the consistent story of her career since 1994. And if Love's Destruction was a sustained process, the final entry on this list managed to end his most important professional relationship in the space of a conversation. 20. Ian Watkins Lost Prophets. Ian Watkins was the frontman of Lost Prophets, a Welsh rock band who built a genuine international fan base through the 2000s on the strength of melodic post-hardcore that headlined festivals and generated consistent MTV rotation. The band was a real commercial operation with a real audience. Watkins was the name and the face of it. In December 2012, he was arrested following a 2-year investigation called Operation Globe. The charges were among the most serious that have ever been brought against a musician in the United Kingdom, multiple counts of serious sexual offenses against children. He pleaded guilty at Cardiff Crown Court in November 2013. The judge described his conduct in terms that made clear the severity went beyond what standard language was equipped to address. He was sentenced to 35 years with a minimum of 29 before parole eligibility. Lost Prophets disbanded immediately and permanently. The recorded catalog was effectively withdrawn from commercial circulation. There was no debate within the band about continuing. There was no faction of the fan base arguing for separation of art and artist. The catalog ceased to commercially exist in any meaningful sense the moment the conviction was announced. He died in HM Prison Wakefield on October 11, 2025, at the age of 47. This is the final entry on this list because it is the most complete version of the phenomenon the list is documenting. A career destroyed overnight because of what was discovered about the person who had built it. Not a bad interview, not a riot, not a fired bandmate. The people who had bought the records and attended the shows were left with the specific experience of discovering that someone they had supported was capable of what Watkins was convicted of. There is no version of a music career that survives that. 20 careers. 20 moments where the trajectory changed so fast that the music press was still writing the headline while the damage was already permanent. Some of these figures rebuilt something from the wreckage. Some did not. A few are still working, still performing, still asking audiences to engage with the music as if the defining moment did not happen. Whether that is possible depends entirely on what the defining moment was. Which of these stories hit you differently than you expected? Drop it in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive into the real history of the genre is what you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.